So the first question is, in what ways is the reform or conservative return to tradition not traditional? And in what ways is it? This is based on the idea that if you went to a Reform temple 75 or 100 years ago, almost none of the men would have been wearing any head covering. They, in fact, would tell you to take off your hat coming in. They might play a pipe organ. Most of the services were in English. And today, if you go into a Reform temple, most of the men and 3/4 of the women are wearing kippot or head coverings and the tallis and the prayer shawl, which you wouldn't have seen 75 years ago. There's a lot more Hebrew. You almost never hear the pipe organ style or the mixed gender choir in sort of what we think of as a church style. And it's become much more traditional, even in private practice. They now have to make accommodations for rabbinic students at Reform seminaries who won't travel on Shabbat and won't use electricity on Shabbat, which the Reform movement never would have considered going back 75 or 100 years.
Well, when we had a Reform temple and a conservative temple, and I went to bar mitzvahs in both of them. And you're right, there was absolutely nobody wearing yarmulkes in the Reform. Whereas the conservative had a box, to pick up, a yarmulke and
the uniform,
even a tallis, I think.
Yeah.
But there was, Reform was very.
I'll actually point out that if you went to a bar mitzvah at a Reform temple, it was already moving back toward more traditional, because the original Reform movement didn't do bar mitzvahs at all. Because they said mitzvah is a ritual commandment. We don't do that. So they had a confirmation that replaced bar mitzvah. So if you talk to people who grew up in a Reform temple in the 10s, 20s, 30s, they didn't do bar mitzvahs. It wasn't until Eastern European Jews made their way into the formerly German Jewish Reform temples that they began to do bar mitzvahs more often after World War II. So in the 50s and 60s, you might have seen.
All my friends got bar mitzvahs.
Right.
But
and you would have seen bar mitzvahs and not bat mitzvahs.
Not bar mitzvahs, no.
Right, because that's post-feminists, when it really takes off, even though the first one is in the 20s and 30s.
I don't recall ever going to a bar mitzvah of anybody of my age. No.
Right. So what's traditional about these things that they've readopted? Well, as I said, they're using more Hebrew. More of them are keeping kosher in some way. The ritual clothing of the kippah and the tallis and so on.
Is that Hebrew?
Kippah is the Hebrew for yarmulke.
Okay.
Right? Yarmulke is the Yiddish phrase.
Yeah.
I think it's actually Polish-based, but I don't remember the etymology exactly. In general, the practices they've chosen make their life more Jewish and less secular or universal, so it's more particularist and less universal. I will point out that finding a new reason to do an old practice is a venerable Jewish tradition, just like eating matzah in the spring had an agricultural root, and then it got the Exodus root, and then it got a rabbinic root. We've been giving new reasons for doing the old things all the time. Same thing with lighting Hanukkah candles. Might have been a solstice thing, now it becomes a miracle of light thing. Well, so that's the fact that they're reinterpreting is itself a Jewish tradition. And I would say that the Reform movement, if you went back 100 plus years, was generally anti-Zionist. It was not in favor of any kind of ethnic Jewish identity as a people, because they wanted to be part of the American people. They wanted to be part of the American nation and not to be accused of dual loyalty. But today, the Reform movement is much more pro-Israel and pro-Zionist. They are willing to criticize it. They're not in sort of the reflexive Israel right or wrong kind of camp, but they require their rabbinic students to spend a year at their Jerusalem campus. They've sponsored kibbutzim, and they sponsor, in fact, the Reform movement in Israel. So there are plenty of examples of growth in that area in a more traditional direction. Now, in what ways is it not traditional, the fact that they've become more traditional? Well, if a woman puts on a kippah or a woman becomes a rabbi, is that more traditional or less traditional? Well,
I mean, it's kind of the same. I mean, it's kind of both in a way. I mean, because women obviously were not supposed to be rabbis or wear a yarmulke, but at the same time, they're occupying a male role. And you know, what is it Elizabeth I said? I know something about what it's like to be in a man's job.
Oh, in the Shakespeare in Love?
Yeah, Shakespeare in Love, yeah.
Right. Yeah, so they're in in an unconventional role of their gender experience, but they're
doing it in the traditional way.
Yeah. There's actually a scholarly term for this. Eric Hobsbawm coined it, I think, called traditioning, where you're trying to make something traditional. You want it to become traditional, feel traditional for you, even if it's not ancient in the way that you wanted it to be. I mean, what counts as your tradition? Your recent non-kosher past or your distant kosher past? Like, which tradition are you following here? If I were to start putting on a kippah, I wouldn't be following either of my family side tradition because they took it off. So, I'm readopting something. And certainly if you're what's called a Jew by choice or someone who's become Jewish, what traditions are you adopting? It's not your family tradition. It's not like an heirloom tradition. It's something very different. Also, I would argue that the conscious choice to follow a tradition is not the same as obeying a directly inherited ancestral tradition. This is the way we've always done it, has a different kind of rationale and practice to it than I'm choosing to now start keeping kosher, or now I'm not going to eat bread on Passover. You've chosen to do that. The end result behaviorally may be the same, but the process of doing it, the meaning of doing it, the impact it has, how long it sticks or how it sticks, I think is somewhat different. And then I guess the last point you could make is only some traditions are being returned to. There is no push in the reform movement to re-gender segregate the sanctuary. Because which side would the rabbi be? I mean,
especially with a female rabbi.
Right, exactly. The rabbi has to be on one side or the other, or both. What does that work? How does that work? So the point is they're not going back to some traditions, right? The reform movement is now more open than ever to welcoming intermarried families. The Reconstructionist movement a few years ago decided to allow rabbinic students if they were married to a non-Jewish partner, which they had not done for their career of being in existence. So in some ways they're less traditional and being more open to, again, gender diversity, to same-sex partnerships, to intermarried partnerships. That's not the direction they're going more traditional, but what might happen is they'll become even more traditional in other ways to compensate for the ways they're being less traditional. Okay, second question. How are secular humanistic Jewish approaches to holidays and life cycle events examples of the balance between creativity and continuity, the present and the past? Creativity in the present versus continuity with past traditions. What are some things that we do that sort of reflect both of those trends?
I don't know.
Well, in creativity, you've rewritten the various songs and sayings that you do, but at the same time, the continuity is that we have the services on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur,
On the day, right.
on the day, and we have a Seder, for the Passover on the second day that has the sort of traditional parts to it. Even if we substitute some things, it still represents the bitter herbs, even if it's not the same thing precisely. Right. So, I mean, we respect the Jewish calendar as it's been passed down by the rabbis, and we celebrate Sukkot and so forth and so on, even if we don't do it in the same fashion or it means the same thing.
Okay, so the rationale might be different, the style of observance might be different, but it has a continuity of, an evolution of that particular holiday observance. Right. And sometimes we'll do it on a day close to that day. So Purim we usually do on the Sunday closest to Purim, not exactly on Purim, but Rosh Hashanah we do on Rosh Hashanah. Friday night is Shabbat. Like that. Right. Some things we stick. Ron, were you going to jump in?
Oh, I just had a thought about the World Cup of soccer and watching that on television, especially when you go to one of these events where it's shown on a giant screen in a public park, and that experience of connection through space, knowing, that feeling of connection through space with at least 1 billion other people. And so these life cycle events, it's a connection to other people through time.
Mm-hmm. Right, especially if you're naming a child after a relative who's deceased, and you talk a little bit about the person they're being named after and the heirlooms they might be using. When we use a family Kiddush cup at a wedding, that connects you to the generations that have used it. Yeah, you can absolutely feel that kind of transcendence through through space and time and to other people.
Well, and even on scales of hundreds or a few thousand years.
Right, right. That Jewish people have used a ring to get married for a long time. The fact that you're using that ritual practice, even if you're reinterpreting what it means or making different choices. Traditionally, by the way, the ring only went from the groom to the bride. The groom didn't wear a ring because it was symbolic of the purchase price. So
that's European tradition as well.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
So
It's much
did
more
that
recent that people wear rings. Yeah.
did that enter Christian Europe from Judaism?
I don't know which came first. Jews also could do it with coins too. That was in the Talmud. Actually, it's described as money more than a ring format. So I don't know which came first. Jews wearing white at weddings, I think, came from Christian practice. Like, they bleed over one way or the other. I would have to do more research on the ring question specifically.
But definitely the groom getting a ring on his finger is pretty new.
Right, right, in Jewish practice. I've done, I think, one wedding where it was only the one way from the groom to the bride out of the 370 weddings I've done. Other examples where we balance things, even if we do traditional elements like have a chuppah for a wedding or blow a shofar at Rosh Hashanah, we choose how to do it, not doing it automatically the traditional way, and we do it because we chose it. And even the rationale of saying we chose this has a different sentiment to it than we have to do this because God said so, or tradition said so, or my grandmother would plots. We didn't do this. We took our family's opinions into account when we planned our wedding, but in the end, it was our wedding. So we made our choices. Okay, number 3. What power or influence do the past and Jewish traditions still hold for secular humanistic Jews?
Well, again, the various life cycle events, I think, have significance, and I think the confirmation, bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, b mitzvah, I think is again a life cycle thing. I think.
But why do those still have some power or resonance?
Because it sets you apart as a certain heritage that you have.
Okay.
Well, I think, like Ron just said, it connects you to all kinds, your past and lots of other people that do the same thing.
So there's an emotional resonance to it, the sense of common ground with other Jewish people, past and present. Ron, were you going to add something?
Yeah, not to label, but you could say that there's harm to others in all people in all times, and good in all humans or most humans. And and it just resonates to me, something I've heard you say before, just that the people of the past, and I may be paraphrasing you, but the people of the past weren't stupid, so
Right.
it's that connection to, they had their understanding and their choices and their practices, and we can honor them by bringing our own human uh you know intelligence, whatever, to saying what that means for us, without saying that you know they were misguided. There was, to recognize the good in them, to recognize the good in people throughout space and time.
Yeah, I'll sometimes say, you may have heard this one before too, that when you're 5 years old, you think your parents know everything, and when you're 15 years old, you've decided your parents know absolutely nothing. And then maybe by the time you're 25 or 35, you realize that they knew some things and they got other things wrong, and they were people and they're flawed, but you have a mature relationship with them where you can handle that. And that's really our model for our relationship to our past, is to say it has some absolute wonderfully wise things in it, and it has some terribly short-sighted, limited, product of their time pieces, and we're able to sort of sift it out and, save the needles in the haystack or the wheat from the chaff, get the good stuff that's valuable to us, because it's a voice that we can hear, but we don't have to obey it. And actually, making choices from a position of knowledge is better. We should know what the options are, and know what they were, and then when we're making our choices, we can say that we made an educated choice. And we can't deny the fact that the Torah was a core part of Jewish life, even if we don't follow all the rules in it. We should know what they are as a record of historic practice, to understand that this was a core part of Jewish intellectual life for many centuries. And then we don't have to read the entire 150-page tractate on how far you can travel on Shabbat before it's too far to carry something. And enough, that's not where we're going to spend our study time. But we can understand the concept and know that it's there and it's ours in some way, and we can choose not to do that. I will also point out that when we do find things that do support our values, that go back a long way, that has an extra special resonance to us. When you find that passage in the Torah that says you cannot withhold a worker's wages, you have to pay them directly so that they are free to make different choices the next day, and you're not, committing wage theft or indentured servitude on the day they do their work. Exactly. That's wonderful. I love that my people had that ethical insight into worker-boss relations, that they put it into a code of laws. That's great. I know that it's next to laws that accept slavery and laws that allow corporal punishment and all kinds of other problems. But I like that they had that insight at least.
Well, there's a real tradition of justice too, which I find very appealing. that the people who are just are the ones that will find God's favor, and in the sense that the king should be just, and a good king is always a just king, and the judges always say that the elders need to be just, and I think that's an important tradition.
Yeah, exactly. So there are positive values to be drawn, and on some level, it's an emotional thing. Any kind of identification with a family heritage, on some level, comes down to emotion. I didn't choose to identify as Swedish and then go dive into Swedish culture and Swedish language and Swedish food. I mean, I've been to an IKEA. I don't think that counts enough. But
you have Jewish.
I have Swedish.
You do, I know.
So yeah.
So in some ways, it'd be more legitimate for you to do that because it's part of your family heritage. I have my family heritage, and I had a positive experience growing up Jewish, and so I wanted my kids to have that positive experience. I did not study the universe of human cultures to decide the best culture for them to be raised in, or pick the best things from Thai culture, and the best thing from Yoruba culture, and the best thing from Xhosa culture, and the best thing from, I could make this sort of cultural hodgepodge of a universal study of human practices and create this Franken-kid who has this culture that's unique to itself. But I didn't. I came from this culture. I have an emotional attachment to it. And it's not wrong to do that. You're not unethical to do that. There's nothing wrong with raising your child with the kind of roots that you did, as long as they have a more open-minded perspective than your ancestors did. If the ancestors never would have thought about looking at the outside world or learning from it, or pretended they didn't learn from it even when they did, our world is one that says, I have my roots in where I am, and I love fusion cuisine. Take me to a Chinese, Mexican deli, right? I want to see what you get when you mix all those together. And I can still go to a Jewish deli if that's what I want, or an Israeli, Lebanese, Palestinian style food restaurant. I can do that too. But I can also experience the joys of the other cultures in the world with an open mind to their human experience, different from mine.
What I found interesting, if you don't mind, Mike,
yeah,
for
please.
a second, was sitting in the service and hearing the shofar, and thinking back that some part of my family had this experience for 2,500 years,
right?
And that it connected me there. And at the same time, we went to a wedding in Minnesota many years ago of one of my fencers, and they had a church that was built by Norwegian immigrants in the wooden style of the Norwegian church, and it was Todd Retzloff,
yeah,
I remember that. And I was sitting there in this church thinking, and this is the way my Swedish ancestors were raised in this, and it was very connecting in a way. And so I find, for me, that this kind of cultural continuity, even if I don't believe all of it necessarily, is very meaningful in rooting me in a tradition that I come from. That makes sense. And I have several traditions like you do.
Sure.
I come from, so it means I have several things to do, but it's important.
I'll also highlight that you've hit on another example of when older is better. We could use a trumpet to make the sound of the shofar. We could have LED lights on a screw-in,
but
menorah
the
thing.
shofar is cool.
It's not the same as hearing the ram's horn or the ibex horn that they use now. Or you could have a Hanukkah app on your phone where you sort of light candle. It's not the same as really lighting candles and turning off the lights. And so sometimes the old-fashioned is better. I mean, we use a Torah scroll and not a Torah Kindle.
Right.
Although you would scroll, right?
Yeah, you can scroll.
Different kind of thing.
Is there really a Hanukkah app, or you just made that up?
Oh, there was one that the Jewish Museum in New York had called Light My Fire, I think was the name of the app.
No, that's funny.
But they discontinued it. I'm sure there are Hanukkah apps where you can do that, and I'm sure there are extensive legal
light
debates.
The fire out of the button,
I'm sure there are extensive legal debates over whether that counts as doing Hanukkah or not. Does it have to be fire or not? Again, there's something about the old that sometimes is better, and if your goal is that sort of cultural roots travel through time kind of experience, then maybe older is better for that kind of practice.
Yeah.
Okay, number 4. How do secular humanistic Jews respond to the idea, nothing Jewish is entirely alien to me?
I don't know how other people respond, but I think that's ridiculous. I look at these Lubavitchers walking down the street, and that's totally alien to me. I mean, I don't feel any connection to them at all in terms of what they believe and what they think.
Even if they're walking down the street holding a menorah because it's Hanukkah time?
I suppose that would be something that would be connected, but I wouldn't say that nothing Jewish is entirely alien to me.
So you don't feel any kind of connection or response to that it's that alien to you?
I don't know. It's pretty alien.
Well, that's why I say entirely. The word entirely does a lot of work in that sentence.
I suppose. Yeah.
Because if you said nothing Jewish is alien to me, there's some things that are pretty alien.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say it's 100% alien. This is an evolution of an old phrase that goes back to the Roman Empire, where someone who I think was an African slave, actually, that became a free citizen, said nothing human is alien to me. That anything a person creates on some level resonates with the human experience.
I guess you're right. I mean, and you're right too. I mean, you're right. I mean, yeah, I can see. It's just harder for me to have that because I'm not really familiar with a lot of the stuff that.
One of the arguments I make sometimes is, so you read an obnoxious story or a prayer that says things that you totally reject and so on, but it's the skeleton in your closet.
Yeah.
It's the 3/5 clause in the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah.
Every culture has their dark side and has their ethical shortcomings, and this is ours. If we want to celebrate the good stuff, we have to accept the other things that are in the same book in the next chapter that we might reject. And it does reflect part of us. The flood story, which is an ethically terrible story about wiping out all the animals except for the 2 lucky horses. What did the 3rd horse do wrong? What did the 4th kangaroo do wrong? Yeah. And they're all getting wiped out because of things people did. And did all the babies deserve to die? I mean, it's terrible. But people do terrible things. They drop nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and look what the Russians are doing in Ukraine to the civilian population. And I mean, people do terrible things. It's all the God is all too human in that respect, and written by human authors that make sense. I mean, we've done terrible things, and there are the skeletons in our closet. So even the things that are objectionable to us are part of our history. We don't want to. The people are talking now about this critical race theory and the 1619 Project studying American history, and they say, well, I don't want anyone to feel upset when they study history. Well, if you're really studying history, you should get upset because they're terrible things. Bro, go ahead.
I'm trying to think how to say this because there's so many negatives, but I guess a response would be that there's nothing good about not being alien. Is that, did I construct that right?
Oh, if you decide to be alienated, it's a bad thing?
No, if we say there is nothing alien, I mean, to say alien, that just because things aren't alien doesn't mean that we can't say that they're entirely terrible. I mean, I would say that raising a daughter and saying you were born a girl and therefore there are things that you will never be able to do. I can't find anything in that that isn't evil. But at the same time, it's not alien to me.
Right, right. Well, I'm not, yes, so I am saying
Yeah.
that you can mark it as bad, but not alien. Or objectionable, or something I reject. But it's part of the human experience, and I can't deny it.
Well, I think also, and that same idea that Ron's saying, I've often, sometimes I said, I have privilege growing up in this country. In the 1950s and 60s when I was growing up, the fact that I was white, and not particularly identifiably a Jewish, I could do lots of things that other people in this country could not do. And so, and you can't, even though you reject racism, there's still racism that you benefit from, and I mean, and it's bad stuff, but you still, yeah.
Right, right. And I will point out that the phrase "nothing Jewish is entirely," the original phrase was "nothing Jewish is alien to me," which was coined by Franz Rosenzweig, who was a German Jewish thinker before World War II. And I put it the entirely because I felt like there are some things that are pretty alien, and certainly if I was a Jewish woman, I'll get people who will say to me, I connect with the global Jewish experience. I love that I can go into any synagogue in the world and they're all saying the same prayers. And I said, yeah, but you're a man.
Yeah.
You can go anywhere in the synagogue. You can hold the Torah scroll. You can recite and sing as loud as you want. If you're a woman, your experience is going to be different.
Yeah, and very different depending on which synagogue
Right,
you go into.
exactly.
Yeah, if I could just interject something for a second.
Please.
I've been thinking about this question ever since we started reading it. And if I go into, let's say, a Lubavitch or a Hasidic temple or a bar mitzvah or whatever, some of those things are pretty alien to me. I have no idea what they're doing, why they're doing it, or what it's about.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what I was getting at.
Well, that's where I'm willing to admit that there'll be some things that will be mostly alien or even almost entirely alien, but not entirely alien because they're still using Hebrew or Yiddish. They're still observing a bar mitzvah. There'll be elements of what you're experiencing that are familiar to you in some way, and familiar in the sense of family, like they're part of your extended heritage.
Could I ask this one thing then? This just popped into my mind. I don't remember if it's, which denomination it is, if it's Lubavitch or Hasidic, when whatever holiday is, they take a chicken and they, circle it around their head.
So this is before Yom Kippur. You do a ritual called Kappa Road or Kapporis in Yiddish, which has the same root as Yom Kippur. You're doing atonement, but you're transferring your sins to the chicken. And then you kill the chicken and you donate the meat to the poor or something like that.
That's how you kill chickens in Kenya.
Swing it over your head? Well, in this case, you're supposed to swing it 3 times, and they prescribe different colors chicken for different kind of people. And there's a whole rigmarole around it. And I'll be honest, there's a substantial number of sort of modern Orthodox or mainstream Orthodox communities that find this absolutely ridiculous. And nobody should ever do this, and this is so primitive. But there's a split even in the Orthodox world over whether one does something like this or not. And for the Hasidic Jews, they say, this is the way we've always done it. This is our tradition, and we've always done it this way. I mean, you even run into this problem in the last 10 years or so, and a content warning on this having to do with circumcision. But there was a practice in some Hasidic communities, not all, but some, called metzitza bepeh, which means after the circumcision, the moil actually uses their mouth to collect the blood and then spits it out somewhere else. And it's a both sort of odd ritual and certainly unsanitary ritual. Babies have gotten sick from this because of the bacteria in the mouth, And so New York State was trying to ban the practice. But certain Hasidic communities, who are voting blocs also, as you know, were absolutely opposed to anyone telling them what they can't do and can do in their ritual practice. And some communities who still have that tradition use a glass pipette or something instead of physically putting, and then it's more sanitary to do that. So there have been evolutions in some Orthodox communities to get back, but some of them will refuse to make that change. And the sense of not making change even goes so far as to changing the past. There's a book that came out about 5 years ago about how the ultra-Orthodox Satmar and other Hasidic communities have even Photoshop edited pictures of famous rabbis' wives to show them with longer sleeves, because they were willing to wear short sleeves in the 1920s and 30s, but now the standard has gotten even more rigid, and so they Photoshop long sleeves onto them so that they meet contemporary standards. It's the memory hole of 1984. I mean, you know, this is the Ministry of Truth working here. But this is the reality where they're projecting back their values even into their own recent past and trying to make it conform to where they are now, because this is the way they've always done it. So how could it possibly be that the founding rabbis' generation were less strict than we are now? We're supposed to be the decline. They're supposed to be more authoritative. The same thing happened with the Satmar Hasidim, who now shave women's heads when they get married, and they maintain shaved heads with only wearing wigs, where in the past they didn't always do that before World War II, but after World War II, part of the trauma was addressed to women's bodies and what they wore and how they behaved, such that they said it was for our sins and we weren't modest enough, we must have caused the disaster, and so now the women have to wear thicker pantyhose and longer sleeves, and their hair is thought to be even more tempting.
So we have to blame the Holocaust on women, basically. I mean,
well, and the men,
that's what it comes
and the men too, for not being strict enough, and that's why they've gotten even more strict. I mean, look, many ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel served in the army until the 1960s. And they had kosher facilities, and they did their army service, and that was acceptable. And then things shifted for a variety of reasons. Okay, last two. If the standard of balancing past and present is what is individually meaningful, how can secular humanistic Jewish communities address varying individual choices? That is, some people will like a modified Shema and a modified conscience, and some people will say, I don't feel comfortable changing this, and some people will say, why are we bothering imitating that, and let's just write something new, and why bother changing it? I want to wear a yarmulke. I don't want to wear a yarmulke. We should have a basket of yarmulkes. I don't want to go to a synagogue that has a basket of yarmulkes. That's what I left. If I went into a room where everybody was wearing a yarmulke and a talis, I wouldn't feel comfortable. That would feel too religious for me. So how do you balance what individuals are choosing to do versus what a community sets as its standards?
Different communities of temples.
Okay, so now we got 6 different humanistic congregations in a 3-mile radius. I mean,
yeah, well, but I mean, that's one way to do it. Otherwise, I mean, like you said, you said before the high holidays this year that there might be some people that come dressed in a yarmulke, and there was actually at least one. Actually, I think there was a guy and a gal that both were wearing the yarmulke, if I remember correctly. And so, I mean, it's just like acceptance of that. If that's what it is, accept it. You know, what else can you do?
Well, them wearing it doesn't affect your life.
Right, doesn't affect them. Well, it's like objecting to gay marriage, and how does that affect my marriage? You know, it doesn't.
Right. So I say everyone's in charge of their own head. They want to wear what they want to wear. That's fine. Yeah. You know, we don't have a dress code at services. And maybe you encourage a variety of celebration styles, or different people to lead. You can have what's called a Kappa Road, sort of a community within a community that runs maybe a more traditional style service, still under the umbrella of humanism, but that reflects different values. We also have to be open to change. You know, I always laugh when someone in a humanistic congregation resists changing the melody to something or bringing in something different, because they say, well, this is the way we've always done it. And I say, do you hear yourself?
It only started in the 1970s. You know?
Well, and part of the point of our whole approach is that that's not sufficient. Sometimes it makes sense. Sometimes we have a reason why we've done it this way and it still operates that way. But just saying this is the way we've always done it, that is not sufficient reason to shut down discussion and to consider something different. So we have to be open to change. That's part of the DNA of our approach to Jewish life. Look at all the things we have changed. So, to say we've always done it this way is not really fair. Another approach is it's okay for people to have diverse practices at home. So as a community, if we're lighting Hanukkah candles, we use humanistic blessings. But if a family chooses to do traditional and humanistic blessings, it's their house. They can do what they want to do. It doesn't affect my life in any way. But what we share is the humanistic secular approach.
Well, there's also like 5 or 6 different sorts of things you can say in the cant when you light the candles in that humanistic booklet. That
yeah. Well, and that was on purpose. I could have said, here is the humanistic blessing, and just had one, and that was it. But in the booklet that I made, I intentionally chose to include, here are a few options.
Yeah.
So that people don't get stuck in the blessing,
which I thought was very
trap.
Interesting, actually.
That was a conscious ideological choice to include options there. Yeah. And I guess the last thing to highlight is that we accept and even celebrate the diversity of choices. So for some years, especially when we were doing food drives, for the high holidays, we'd give out bags with a wish list at Rosh Hashanah, and then we collect them back on Yom Kippur. And the framing we would use is, in our community, people choose if they want to fast on Yom Kippur or not. But out there in the real world, some people don't get to choose whether they're fasting or not because they simply don't have food to eat. And so let's, act to help them. Whether or not we're choosing not to eat, we can help with that need. And that's taking the diversity of practice and making a positive out of it to actually bring the community together through those diverse approaches. It does get tricky sometimes. If somebody really wants the traditional Kaddish to be recited in your community, that's going to be divisive, and you need to find a way to say no nicely, or to find a humanistic version that works for them and work that in once in a while so they know when it's coming, and the people who don't like it don't have to be there. Brown, please.
Reminds me of the town with 3 synagogues and 2 Jews.
Yeah.
I mean,
they each need one, they won't set foot in.
Humanistic Jews are a bit thin on the ground.
Yes.
So if we're gonna start schisming,
Well, I will say there was actually a case of this where there was a humanistic congregation in Washington, D.C., and there was a contingent in that group that really that totally bought the humanism, but really wanted to say the traditional Shema and the traditional Kaddish. And there were some hardcore absolute humanists who said, no, we don't do that. And in the end, there was a split. And there was Machar, which was the diehard humanist, and there was Beth Chai, which was the humanist except for Shema and Kaddish. And they would frame it as, our ancestors said this, so we're going to say it the way our ancestors said it. And they had a separate parallel existence, and I think they're both still around.
Or was to say that's the traditional.
It's a traditional explanation
for why there are 2 groups of anything in a lot of societies, but particularly where we were in Kenya.
In Kenya, there was like, why is there X and Y? Well, they were brothers, X and Y, and they quarreled, and so so they split. And it's the same sort of
anything where there's 2 over 3.
So the best story that I heard about that was one of my teachers at Northwestern, Ivor Wilkes, who had been actually a colonial officer in the Gold Coast, and he said, there's Williamstown and there's Charleston. Is it Charles? I think it's Charlestown. And they were named after British kings. And so he said, just for fun, one time he asked one of the Akan people, he said, well, why is there Williamstown and there's Charlestown? And the guy thought for me, he says, well, there were these 2 brothers, and they had an argument. It's the explanation always for these things.
But it's not just in Africa; it's in Native American.
Sure.
Yeah, it's funny.
Yeah, Brown, go ahead.
Oh, just another thought that I had, that the SHJ affiliate in Portland, they don't use congregation in the name.
Right. They like community.
Because that's too that's too synagogue-y for some people.
Well, look, I mean, I'm a humanistic rabbi, and there are parts of the secular humanistic Jewish movement more broadly that are not so thrilled about using the title rabbi because they feel like rabbi is authority, rabbi is telling you what to do, it's hierarchical, and they're egalitarian. And my approach is I try to be an authority without being authoritarian. And we use authorities all the time in medicine and science and scholarship. I mean, people know more than we do, and we rely on them for their expertise and their knowledge and their skill. And I sort of see myself in that category of a non-authoritarian authority. And my job is to empower you. And sometimes I'm the tour guide who's telling you where to go, and sometimes I'm the travel agent who says, "Where do you want to go?" And I'll help you go where you want to get to.
I was gonna say, are you trying to say you see yourself more as the guide on the side and not the mage on the stage?
No, I get a little bit of both. Okay, last question. What are advantages and disadvantages to that inheritance model of Jewish culture that I read at the end of the passage? Advantages or disadvantages to that approach?
I'm not sure what you mean.
Well, like rhetorically, what works about it and what are some of the holes in it?
You mean?
Talking about Jewish culture as an inheritance, where you get to choose from the past and some you like and some you chuck.
Well, I think for me, I think it fits modern ideology better. One of the major breaks of the Enlightenment from preceding European history, and I think there are other places where you can look at that, is the ability to be rational and choose what works for you, as opposed to this is the way it's always been and you have to accept it, or else we ostracize you or we condemn you to the block or whatever. Mm-hmm. So I mean that's definitely the advantage. The disadvantage is that, well, geez, you have to think and make choices, which for a lot of people is hard. I mean, many people, I don't know if most, but many people prefer to be told what they need to do and what is the proper and comfortable way to do it, rather than think out. It's uncomfortable, and it's difficult to have to make those choices and say, this is what I think is good for us to do, instead of having you tell me as the rabbi, saying, well, this is what you should be doing.
I get people at weddings all the time saying, we just wanted to do the traditional vows. I said, well, you're from different traditions, and there's no one set of vows, and that's not how things work these days. This is the downside of freedom. Yeah, there's all those choices.
Yeah. But if you think of Jewish tradition as a culture, if you take anything out of culture and out of a culture and out of its context, it immediately changes. Mm-hmm. So then you're not getting what you think you're choosing.
Right. I will say that for some people, the authority of the deceased and the inheritance increases after they're gone. Like I can't touch anything, I can't change anything because this is the way they had it. Where when they were alive, you could sort of ignore their phone calls or whatever. But now it gets a sort of a canonized, crystallized approach. Or maybe inherited tradition abides in a way that a deceased relative's property doesn't. It's my great aunt's attic, and I don't really care that much about it. Unlike my menorah, unlike my Passover Seder that I do every year. Using the idea of throwing out culture feels kind of dismissive. And I'd also argue that our options in choosing from Jewish culture are much broader than just a family inheritance. If you're an Ashkenazi background, secularly humanistic Jew, you can have a Sephardic style charoset for your Seder. That's okay. It doesn't have to be just your family lineage that you're allowed to do. And certainly for people who are joining the Jewish family, again, the so-called Jews by choice, or people who've become Jewish, they don't have that heirloom. And that attic metaphor doesn't work for them at all. In fact, it alienates them because they don't have an heirloom menorah that's been passed down for generations. And so it works for some Jews, but it doesn't work for all Jews. And so that you have to deploy it with caution. And I'll also point out that this is a comment someone else made at an earlier class that I thought was really insightful, so I wrote it down and learned from it because we can do things new ways. The attic is where you put stuff you ignore most of the time, till you have to clean it out, till you sell the house, till there's a leak or something in the roof. But the attic is where you're dumping stuff.
Stuff
It's
you
not
don't
the stuff
really
you're
want to get
actively
rid
using.
of, but you
Right.
don't really want to get rid of it, but you don't pay much attention
It's
to
like
it.
the
It's storage locker.
ignored archive, the
Yeah.
storage locker. Right. It's not your active thing. So, and parts of Jewish culture are not just old and dusty; they're actively used and every day. So it's it's a tricky metaphor. There's no perfect metaphor. I once heard it said that metaphors are like a leaky bucket. They carry water for a while, but eventually it peters out. And so that's true for the attic inheritance too. Bron, I see you unmuted.
Well, just that the attic, what was I gonna say? That that the attic is also where you put things when you can't either bring yourself to get rid of them or you can't bear to get rid of them, but you don't really want to have to deal with them.
Right,
So you give them to your kids.
right, and then you figure your kids will deal with it. Or someone else in our
Yes.
case.
Yeah, I just want to make a stupid comment. I was cleaning my crawl space today, and when I'm cleaning it, it's not some of the things I just only use once every year or two. So it's not ignoring them. It's just you just don't need them in front of you all the time until you need it.
Just today, I came across our roof shovel in our garage, which is a shovel that has 3 different metal pieces that you can put together, and then you can use it to sort of shovel off the end of your roof so you don't get the ice dam in the gutter. Didn't use it once this year because didn't have enough snow and didn't last long enough. So, I've gone 2 or 3 years without taking it out, but it's there, and I know it's there, and I use it if I need it. So, maybe Jewish culture is a bit like that. The some of the pieces we don't need to focus on all the time. Other things we use every day, like our front door or our, refrigerator. So there are going to be some pieces that speak to us every day and some pieces that didn't, and different families are going to do that differently, just as different communities in the Jewish world make different choices from that culture too. In the end though, I would not go backwards. I had a history professor in high school actually, doing AP European history. And somebody asked him once, Dr. Cowie, if you could choose when you would want to live, when would you like to live? And he said, right now.
Yeah.
Even if only for the dentistry.
Yeah.
But, with the medicine and health and science and knowledge and culture and everything else, I would live now. So whatever nostalgia I might have for the days of Rashi or Maimonides, or the conviviencia in medieval Spain between Jews and Muslims and Christians. The best time in Jewish life is now, because the highest percentage of the Jewish people can participate in creating a living Jewish culture, post-feminism, post-multicultural inclusion, post-intermarriage inclusion. I mean, this is the best time, and it's getting better in many, many ways. Are there challenges? Of course. But I would rather have Jewish diversity than Jewish unity at the expense of modernity. That's not the world I want to live in.
I wouldn't want to live in the world of my great-grandfather back in Russia,
Right.
With arranged marriage and
Exactly.
I don't find that attractive at all.
Right. So our next session will be, I don't think it's next week, or is it 2 weeks? I always think I should.
Next week?
No, I thought we had.
I always think I should check the calendar
Well,
before
I have to look
start
too.
talking.
I believe I looked at the calendar today or yesterday,
Next week? Okay.
and there is one scheduled next
Yes.
week.
So next week we're going to turn to talking about
next week
our intellectual roots. We'll talk a little bit about the concept of roots and precursors and so on, and how can you claim someone as yours. But we'll look more specifically at the case of the Yiddishists, the secular, often socialist or labor movement oriented people who were the first innovators of secular Jewish communities and on some level secular Jewish identity. Now, one of their claims was that it had to be rooted in a language. And in their case, their daily language was Yiddish. And that became their mama lashon, their mother language, but also the basis of their ethnic Jewish identity. And so one of the questions we'll have to explore is, can you have that secular Jewish community if you're not living in the cultural context of a daily language. And we'll have that discussion next time.